Think your lunch was bad? Try eating bread full of rocks, mouldy milk and eel pie seasoned with regret. Welcome to medieval cuisine, where every meal might be your last. Think your diet is rough because your oat milk expired yesterday. Welcome to the medieval times where every meal was a gamble and the house always won. This was a time when food wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was a survival lottery. You didn't ask if something was gluten-free. You asked if it had actual food in it or just dirt bark and hope. Let's set the scene. You're a medieval peasant, congrats, statistically accurate. You wake up at dawn with an empty stomach and a slim chance of breakfast. Your pantry, a clay pot with yesterday's boiled turnip water, maybe if you're lucky a piece of dry bread so hard it could be used in self-defense. But hey, at least the nobles were eating well, right? Sort of, if you count roasted peacock dyed with saffron and served with a side of gout as eating well. The rich feasted on an all-meat buffet while the poor were praying for a single onion. You might think the nobles had it better, but trust me, when your dinner ends with vomiting blood from lead poisoning, it's not exactly a Michelin-starred experience. Meanwhile, food hygiene was a Renaissance concept, meaning it didn't exist yet. Meat was sold on open-air stalls, swarmed by flies, dusted with a fine layer of horse poop. Salted or not, everything was basically 1 degree away from biohazard. Ever wonder why people died young? Spoiler alert. It wasn't just the Black Death, it was breakfast. And speaking of death, famine wasn't a rare event, it was a recurring guest star. One bad harvest and boom, your village is dining on boiled leather shoes. People ate grass, people ate their pets, people ate each other. Next time your food delivery is 10 minutes late. Remember, someone in 1315 died trying to eat a rotting pigeon nailed to a barn door. So buckle up. Because we're going to explore every crusty, maggoty, blood-dripping detail of what medieval people put in their mouths and why it might have been the last thing they ever did. This isn't just a food documentary, it's culinary horror with historical accuracy. Bon appétit, brave soul. You've officially taken a seat at the table of doom. Bread, the humble staple of life. Or in the medieval world, a beige-coloured execution method. Everyone ate it, peasants, priests, kings, beggars. But bread in the 1300s didn't exactly resemble the soft, Instagrammable loaves you know today. Imagine biting into a brick made of regret, gravel, and mystery grain. If your teeth didn't break first, your intestines would file a formal complaint shortly after. Let's talk ingredients. Most medieval bread contained more surprises than nutrition. Bakers often mixed rye, barley, old flour, pea flour, or whatever was lying around and vaguely edible. Sometimes even sawdust or clay, yes clay, because when you're desperate, everything becomes seasoning. Grain was stone ground, which meant chunks of actual rock got into the dough. Chew carefully, or risk a dental situation worse than medieval dentistry, which, fun fact, often involved pliers. Then came the real killer, ergot. A toxic fungus that grew on rye, invisible to the eye but fatal to the gut. People would hallucinate, convulse, or just quietly die after a hearty slice of infected bread. Entire villages experienced what historians now think were mass poisonings, mistaken for demonic possession. So next time you blame gluten for your stomachache, be grateful it's not hallucinogenic black rot. But bread was sacred. Literally. It was used in religious ceremonies, handed out as alms and blessed by priests before being devoured like holy gravel. No one questioned it because, well, what else was there? Not eating bread meant starvation. Eating it meant risking seizures, insanity, or spontaneous plague sweats. Pick your apocalypse. Even the quality of bread was used as a social marker. The nobility got fine white loaves, soft and sifted, while peasants gnawed on coarse black bread that could double as roofing material. In some towns, bakers had to pass government inspections, but instead of testing for toxins, officials just made sure loaves weren't underweight. You could literally poison half your customers and get away with it as long as the bread didn't look too small. So next time you hear someone rave about artisanal ancient grain, just smile. And remember that in the Middle Ages, bread was less a farm-to-table delicacy and more a flour-to-funeral pipeline. Picture this. It's 7 a.m. The rooster's screaming and you're already buzzed. Not because you're an alcoholic, but because you're alive in medieval Europe and water is trying to kill you. That clear, innocent-looking stream behind your house. It's less Evian and more Coley cocktail, full of feces, dead rats, rotting meat, and whatever your upstream neighbours decided to dump yesterday. So what did people do instead? They drank beer for breakfast. But don't get too excited. This wasn't your craft IPA with citrus notes and a flirty 6.8% ABV. Medieval beer was flat warm and about as sexy as a bucket of soggy bread. It was called small beer low in alcohol, barely fermented but just alcoholic enough to kill bacteria. Think of it as weak beer with a hero complex. And yes, children drank it too. Because when your choices are beer or cholera, you don't care about age restrictions. Brewing was everywhere. Monasteries brewed it, housewives brewed it, your weird neighbour with a rat farm brewed it. Beer was a lifesaver, a social glue, and often safer than soup. Because soup needed water. And water, as we've established, was basically medieval Russian roulette. Still not convinced water was public enemy number one? Imagine filling your wooden cup at the local well, only to discover your neighbour's pig drowned in it yesterday. Wells were often contaminated rivers doubled as sewers and rain barrels. Well, let's just say roofs weren't made of stainless steel. Drinking water was an act of medieval bravery. More than once, a refreshing drink led to a 3-day death spiral. And the best part, they didn't even know why. Germ theory wouldn't arrive for another 600 years. People just felt that beer was safer, like a divine instinct, or the ancestors of modern college students. So next time someone lectures you about hydration, raise a pint of water and say, at least it doesn't come with plague in it. Unless you're in a Renaissance fair, then maybe double check. If you think forgetting a milk carton in your fridge for 2 weeks is gross, congratulations, you're still ahead of medieval dairy culture. In the Middle Ages, milk had the shelf life of a fruit fly with anxiety. No refrigeration, no pasteurization, just a warm clay jug of rapidly souring cow juice sitting in a smoky hut next to a pig. If it didn't curdle, it probably wasn't milk, and yet people drank it. Kind of. Sometimes, when they weren't convinced it was unclean, unhealthy, or unholy. Milk was considered child food by many adults and suspiciously associated with weakness in digestion and the kind of bowel movements that could take down a monastery. If you were lucky, it turned into cheese. If you were unlucky, it turned into revenge. Speaking of cheese, yes, they made it. Yes, it was funky. But not the cute brie on a board kind of funky. We're talking robust wheels of mouldy dairy ripened in wooden sheds with questionable airflow and a healthy colony of bugs. Cheese was a way to keep milk from killing you by letting it almost kill you and then backing off at the last second. If the mould was blue, green or hairy, that was just character. Then came butter, which wasn't stored in a fridge because what's a fridge? It was kept in barrels, crocks or directly on the table under a thin crust of dust and despair. Butter spoiled fast, so people either ate it quickly or prayed hard. There was no unsalted grass-fed churned before dawn by Scandinavian angels. There was just sort of yellow stuff we scraped the top off. And here's the kicker. They often like the tang. Sour milk, fermented whey cheese that could fight back. These were normal, expected, even preferred. In a world without hygiene or consistent taste, strong flavours meant this has been around long enough not to kill me immediately. So next time your almond milk turns a little funky, remember to a medieval peasant that's just premium seasoning. Let's talk meat, the dream of every medieval feast and the nightmare of every medieval stomach. In theory, meat was a luxury. In practice, it was a microbial war zone. You didn't stroll into your local butcher and grab a vacuum-sealed steak. You hoped a pig died recently wasn't green yet and hadn't been stepped on by a cart. If it smelled only slightly off, dinner was served. Here's where the spice myth comes in. You've probably heard it, medieval people use spices to cover the taste of rotting meat. Sounds clever, right? Except spices back then cost more than some marriages. Pepper was so expensive it was stored in locked boxes. You wouldn't waste it on roadkill pork unless you hated your guests and had money to burn. The truth. If the meat was rotten, no amount of cinnamon was saving your colon. But they did love spices when they could get them. Saffron, nutmeg, cloves, ginger, imported at horrifying prices and sprinkled like gold dust onto royal dinners. This wasn't flavour, it was power. Nobles used spice-laced food the way rappers use diamond chains. Look what I can afford to put in my mouth and not die. Meanwhile, peasants were lucky if their stew had salt, and not the kind scraped off the barn floor. As for food safety laws, adorable. The concept barely existed. Meat was sold in open markets on wooden slabs under a blazing sun swarmed with flies big enough to have names. No refrigeration, no hand washing, just a prayer and some mustard to mask the texture of advanced decay. It wasn't farm to table, it was carcass to coffin, yet somehow people survived. Not all of them, but enough. They built stomachs of steel and livers of legend. They didn't ask, is this safe? They asked, will this kill me faster than starvation? And if the answer was probably not, they tucked in with both hands and said grace. That, dear reader, is commitment to the bit. Fish the religious loophole protein. Thanks to the church, meat was banned on Friday's holy days and roughly half the calendar year. So people turned to fish because apparently God was fine with you eating creatures that couldn't blink. But this wasn't a fresh salmon on a cedar plank situation. This was salted herring in a barrel that's older than your grandmother territory. If the smell didn't convert you to atheism, the taste might. Fish preservation in the Middle Ages was a game of guesswork and salt. Lots and lots of salt. If you could still see the fish under the salt crust, it wasn't salted enough. Some fish were dried to the point of becoming medieval jerky. You didn't chew them so much as wrestle them into submission. And when the fish was slightly fresher, well, let's just say a few extra hours in the sun gave it personality. The clergy, being the original food influencers, leaned hard into seafood. Monasteries had fish ponds. Bishops threw eel banquets. Eels were the bacon of the medieval world, ubiquitous, greasy, and found in everything. Eel pies, eel stews, eel jelly. And yes, it was exactly as slimy and unsettling as it sounds. Somewhere along the way, someone thought, you know what this religious feast needs. A tube of muscular mucus. But the fish trade had a darker side, fraud and illness. Merchants sold spoiled fish as aged delicacies. Some labelled meat as fish just to pass religious law. Beaver tails, for instance, were considered fish by church officials. Why? Because they were vaguely wet and flat. Logic. The results. Food poisoning disguised as divine discipline. Eat poorly, repent harder. Of course, the irony is that these fishy fasts were supposed to be acts of piety. Sacrifice. Cleanse the soul. But in practice, it was a roulette of maggot-ridden cod theological loopholes and spiritual indigestion. Because nothing says devotion like choking down a questionable carp fillet while staring at a fresco of the Last Supper. If peasants ate like survivalists, nobles ate like medieval gods on borrowed time, picture a hall echoing with drunk laughter, a table groaning under the weight of meat towers, and a guy in tights gnawing on a roast swan with his bare hands. These weren't meals, they were edible power statements. You didn't just attend a feast, you survived it. And if your ankles swelled and your teeth fell out by dessert, well, that was the price of prestige. Let's start with the menu: swan, peacock, boar, venison, partridge, and anything else that moved slower than a crossbow bolt. Presentation was everything. Birds were redressed in their own feathers after roasting like some bizarre meat fashion show. Some dishes were designed to look alive on arrival heads, intact eyes, open necks posed in judgment. Imagine cutting into your dinner while it silently stared at you, judging your life choices. Of course, the rich weren't exactly counting calories. A typical noble could eat more in one meal than a peasant family had in a week. Meat with meat on top of meat garnished with meat. All of it drowned in sauces so strong they could double as floor cleaner. And let's not forget sugar liberally dumped onto everything, including meat pies. 'Cause nothing says refined taste like pork marinated in honey and regret. Now for the side effects: gout, the rich man's disease. Caused by endless meat and wine, it turned your joints into inflamed torture devices. Nobles waddled through castles on bloated feet, clinging to cane and dignity. Gout became a badge of excess, like, yes, my toes are on fire, but have you ever eaten 37 oysters in one sitting? Meanwhile, peasants just had regular hunger pains, not flaming ankle joints of aristocratic doom. And hygiene. Let's just say those gilded halls weren't Febreze friendly. Food rotted mid-feast. Grease slicked the tables. Dogs gnawed on bones under the tables, often next to vomit from someone's fourth course. You know it's bad when the jester is the cleanest thing in the room. So yes, noble feasts were dazzling. But they were also slow-motion heart attacks and candlelight. Let's step away from the velvet-draped banquet halls and enter the real medieval dining room. A mud floor, a wooden bowl, and a meal so beige it made sadness look colourful. Peasant cuisine wasn't about flavour, it was about not dying. The star of the show, gruel. A watery mix of oats, barley, or whatever was left in the sack after the rats had their turn. Add a pinch of salt and you had yourself a peasant 5-star special. Forget forks. You ate with your hands, sometimes a spoon if your village was feeling fancy. Bread was the holy grail, hard, dark, chewy, and often doubling as a dental test. Vegetables. Only if you grew them. Most of the time you just foraged for weeds roots or edible-looking leaves that probably weren't poisonous. Dinner wasn't something to enjoy, it was something to survive. Meat was a mythical event. A festival miracle. If you ever ate pork, it was usually every part except the pork. Hooves, tails, ears, and intestines boiled into something that looked like punishment and smelled like despair. Most protein came from beans, lentils, or bugs you didn't know were in the stew. And if you tasted something unusual, just smile and keep chewing. Asking questions didn't end well. Still, peasants were creative. They made pottages, thick soups of boiled everything. One pot fed the family for days, and flavours improved as it fermented into something almost resembling taste. Leftovers weren't just reheated, they lived in that pot. Generations of flavour. And bacteria, mostly bacteria. But hey, if it didn't kill your uncle last week, it's probably fine today. And let's talk beverages. Remember, beer peasants drank the weak kind. Sometimes they had ale brewed at home, or water they blessed before sipping, just in case a demon was swimming in it. Milk was for babies or emergency stomach death. Anything remotely clean was reserved for the Lord. So peasants said a prayer, took a sip, and hoped it was the good kind of burning. You'd think vegetables would be a medieval peasant's best friend, right? Cheap growable, vaguely edible, what's not to love? Apparently everything according to the medieval elite. Many folks back then believed vegetables were cold, moist and dangerous to your health, like a salad with commitment issues. Some even thought raw veggies could corrupt your soul. Yes, lettuce was spiritually suspicious. Doctors read men with leeches, and Latin warned that vegetables caused gas weakness and melancholy humours. You know, just regular human digestion, but wrapped in moral panic. Cabbage, leeks, onions, they were all seen as peasant food, lowly dirty, and probably plotting your demise from inside your stew. Nobles preferred meat because meat was warm dry and masculine like a sword you could chew. Vegetables, feminine, passive, basically suspicious. Even monasteries had debates over this green menace. Some monks swore by garden vegetables while others treated them like edible sins. The church occasionally allowed veggies during fasts, but there was always that unspoken vibe, eat too many turnips and you're halfway to heresy. And don't even get started on garlic good for flavour, terrible for kissing relics. Smelling like an herb garden was socially unacceptable unless you were a corpse. And let's be clear, these weren't heirloom organic superfoods. Medieval vegetables were tiny, bitter, stringy, and occasionally trying to become sentient. Carrots were purple or white and tasted like sadness. Beets were basically root-flavoured dirt. You didn't eat them because you wanted to, you ate them because everything else had either died, run away, or developed a voice and asked you to stop. So yes, vegetables were technically on the menu, but not respected. Not celebrated. Just tolerated like a disappointing cousin at a family feast. Today we juice kale and sprinkle microgreens on toast. Back then people feared spinach like it owed them money. The next time you turn your nose up at side salad, just remember, at least you won't be exorcised for eating it. Let's get this out of the way. Yes, medieval Europeans ate people, but make it medicinal. Welcome to the glamorous, horrifying world of corpse medicine, where the only thing between you and a migraine cure was a powdered Egyptian mummy. This wasn't a fringe cult thing. This was mainstream health advice from scholars, priests and doctors with names like Theodoric the Surgeon. If you had money, you didn't just buy drugs, you bought bits of dead people. The logic simple. The human body, when properly dried, smashed or soaked in wine, could heal itself. Or at least heal someone else, preferably someone not currently decomposing. Skull powder was popular for seizures. Human fat was used to treat wounds. Blood fresh, if possible, was prescribed for vitality. There are actual accounts of people lining up at executions with little cups like it was a morbid smoothie bar. And don't forget mummy powder. Real imported ancient Egyptian mummies were ground up and sold in apothecaries across Europe. Rich people sprinkled it into wine or mixed it into food, believing it carried magical preservation powers. Which is ironic, considering most of them died bloated and poisoned. Imagine spending a fortune just to sprinkle 2,000-year-old royalty on your toast and still dying of bad digestion. But it wasn't just the rich. Poor folks got in on the action too. Grave robbing was practically a side hustle. Executioners sold body parts under the table, sometimes literally under the table, and battlefield corpses mysteriously disappeared overnight. No one was safe from being rebranded as medicine. You died of the plague great, now you're someone's arthritis treatment. The recycling economy was alive and well. It all sounds insane now, but remember they didn't have Tylenol, or antibiotics, or any idea how the human body actually worked. So when a robed man with a scroll told you to rub your chest with liquefied thief fat, you did it, because the alternative was to die without rubbing thief fat on your chest. Honestly, we've all made worse decisions at 2 a.m. with a headache. Here's a fun medieval fact. If you ate 3 meals in a row, you were either royalty or hallucinating. For the average person, food wasn't a daily guarantee, it was a seasonal miracle. Crop failure. Get ready to chew grass like it's kale. One bad harvest, one overly damp summer, or one plague of enthusiastic locusts, and your diet went from meagre to imaginary. Hunger wasn't a rare tragedy, it was baked into the calendar. The Great Famine of 1315 till 1317. That wasn't just a footnote, it was a Europe-wide food collapse. Rain fell like it had a grudge. Fields flooded, grain rotted, livestock drowned in muddy pits. People ate whatever wasn't nailed down, and then they ate things that were nailed down. Tree bark, shoe leather, animal dung, it all became edible in quotation marks. Parents abandoned children. Children stole from dying neighbours. Entire villages cannibalised their dignity and sometimes each other. Chroniclers recorded mothers eating infants, but no one knows how much of that was fact or medieval PR for "don't question the church." Either way, if your village survived a famine, you didn't just celebrate, you wept over actual bread like it was holy scripture. And here's the twist: in the rare times of abundance, people feasted like there was no tomorrow because there often wasn't. No food preservation, no refrigeration, and no idea when the next locust rave would destroy everything. You gorged yourself sick on the good days because the bad ones were always coming. Modern humans store food in pantries. Medieval humans stored calories in their bodies and prayed. So yes, feast or famine wasn't just a saying, it was the daily roulette wheel of existence. One week you're roasting a pig over a fire, the next week you're boiling nettles and pretending it's soup. And through it all, people kept farming, kept hoping, and kept chewing on things that probably shouldn't have been chewed. Survival wasn't elegant. It was dirty, hungry, and impressively creative. Medieval markets were chaos with a strong odour. Imagine narrow, muddy streets crammed with stalls, pigs roaming freely, raw meat hanging beside buckets of eels, and someone loudly selling fresh milk that was definitely alive in the wrong way. Now add no refrigeration, no gloves, and zero idea what salmonella is. Congratulations, you're shopping for dinner in the 14th century. Try not to step in anything sentient. But beyond the filth was a layer of legal weirdness, forbidden foods. Depending on the time, place and mood of your local bishop or bureaucrat, certain foods were banned, restricted, or just frowned upon into oblivion. Meat on Fridays sinful. Beaver tail. Weirdly acceptable, it was classified as fish. Logic took a long lunch break in medieval food law. You could be fined, whipped, or thrown in jail for eating the wrong animal at the wrong hour with the wrong sauce. Markets were supposed to be regulated, but regulation meant one sweaty guy walking around yelling at people. Officials measured loaves of bread not for poison, but to make sure bakers weren't skimping on size. The punishment for short-weight bread. The pillory. Yes, public shaming because your sourdough wasn't dense enough. Meanwhile, fishmongers could sell 3-day-old trout with a straight face as long as they smiled piously. And don't forget the food fraud. Horse meat sold as venison. Rat passed off as rabbit. A popular trick was stuffing a pie with whatever meat was on hand, covering it with expensive-looking crust, and selling it as Lord's delight. Spoiler. The only thing lordly about it was the disease you got after. Dishonest cooks were everywhere, which is how trust your butcher became a genuine survival tactic. Still, markets were where people lived. Not just for food, but gossip, flirting, bargaining, and passive-aggressively comparing turnips. You could trade a goat for a barrel of beer or a chicken for someone's future regret. It was dirty, noisy, dangerous, and the heart of community life. Because no matter how gross the sausage stall was, it still beat starving quietly in a hut. Imagine cooking dinner with tools designed by someone who hated you and had never heard of basic safety. Welcome to the medieval kitchen, where open flames melting lead and splintering wood came together in one smoky death trap. Fireplaces weren't quaint. They were infernos with bad ventilation and a habit of eating homes. Potholders didn't exist. Chimneys barely functioned, and everything was cooked in pots you could lose a hand in. Julia Child, this was not. Let's start with the cauldron, the medieval instant pot, minus the safety features, and with a much higher risk of third-degree burns. made of iron, or if you were unlucky, lead it hung over the fire by a chain that sometimes broke. When it fell, it didn't just spill soup, it spilled scalding lava onto your foot. Bonus, if it was lead-lined, you also got a slow, irreversible dose of heavy metal poisoning. Dinner and neurological damage all in one. Knives were everywhere, sharp rusted, and often passed down through 3 generations of tetanus. There were no cutting boards, people chopped food on wooden tables, dirt floors, or their own hands if they got distracted. Cross-contamination wasn't a concept. It was a lifestyle. Raw meat, muddy roots, and the occasional rat tail all shared the same blade, possibly cleaned once a year with spit and good intentions. Bake ovens were even worse. Massive brick chambers heated to molten lava levels. They were often outside to avoid torching the house a real risk. Bakers shoved loaves inside using wooden paddles the size of oars and hoped nothing exploded. Smoke inhalation, normal. Burned arms, badge of honour. And if you fell into the oven, yes, that happened, you became an awkward funeral story and possibly next week's pie filler. Even water was dangerous. Medieval kitchens stored it in heavy splinter-prone buckets, and hauling it in meant dragging gallons from wells, rivers, or barrels full of things that should not be in water. One slippery step, and suddenly your bathwater was a murder weapon. So yes, cooking was a skill, but it was also an extreme sport, and if you managed to prepare food and survive the process, you were already doing better than most. Think your friend chewing with their mouth open is gross. Try sharing a wooden slab with 6 strangers who all double-dip wipe their noses with the tablecloth and occasionally throw bones at each other for fun. Welcome to medieval table manners where etiquette ranged from mildly unhygienic to what in God's crusty name are you doing? Forks barely existed. Most people ate with their hands, their knives, and whatever dignity remained after 3 cups of hot ale. Instead of plates, diners used trenchers, stale slabs of bread that soaked up grease sauce and existential despair. When you were done eating, you either tossed your soggy bread plate to the dogs or gave it to a beggar, which somehow counted as charity. Hands weren't washed before meals unless you were a noble, and even then it was symbolic at best. Licking your fingers was totally acceptable. So was wiping them on your clothes, your neighbour's cloak, or the nearest curtain. Guests shared cups, spoons, and whatever was crawling on the meat. Slurping was fine. Talking with your mouth full encouraged, especially if it involved gossip about who died last week from meal pie. Burping was a compliment to the cook. Sneezing into the stew was unfortunate, but hey, no one was going to waste it. Food was scarce after all, and clean was still considered more of a personality trait than a hygiene goal. And if you misbehaved, you might be banished to the low table or worse, miss dessert, which in medieval times usually meant a slightly less spoiled version of whatever you just ate. Nobles had strict etiquette manuals, but they were mostly used for show or to shame the new guy. The truth is, the louder and messier the feast, the better. Because in a world where you could die from mouldy cheese or a poorly placed spoon, every meal was a celebration of still being here. So yes, medieval people had manners, just not the kind you'd want at Thanksgiving. Next time someone elbows you at brunch or drinks from your glass, be grateful they're not also spitting mutton bones at your feet or using a bread bowl as a napkin. Progress isn't always glamorous. Sometimes it's just not licking the communal knife. In the Middle Ages, sugar wasn't a pantry staple, it was edible wealth. Only the elite could afford it, and when they didn't just sprinkle it, they weaponized it. Sugar was poured into everything from meats to vegetables to medicinal concoctions that could double as slow-acting poisons. If it stood still, they sugared it. If it moved, they caught it, roasted it, and then sugared it. Welcome to the medieval sweet tooth, where cavities were a sign of class. Sugar came from far-off places, often at the cost of human suffering, slavery conquest, and trade routes paved in blood and molasses. But for nobles, it was worth it. Imagine throwing a dinner party and revealing a sugar sculpture of a castle or a lion, or your own smug face. Guests wouldn't eat it, they'd worship it. Sugar wasn't food, it was medieval flex culture in solid form. Unfortunately, eating like royalty also meant dying like royalty. Sugar rotted teeth faster than anyone could say tooth powder, which was made of crushed coral, burned bread, or literal urine. That's right. Medieval dental hygiene was just vibes and pain. Nobles often smiled with a mouthful of blackened stumps which somehow still counted as fashionable. Because nothing says power like not being able to chew your own roast duck. Doctors even prescribed sugar for illnesses. Got a fever? Try syrup. Bad dreams. More syrup. Open wound. Pack it with honey and pray. Some recipes called for candy-coated spices, candied meats, and sugar pills mixed with mercury. If that sounds like a Willy Wonka death spiral, you're not wrong. Sweetness wasn't just pleasure, it was pathology with frosting. So while peasants were gnawing on onions and calling it dinner, nobles were gorging on sugar until their teeth fell out and their stomachs gave up. But hey, they died full and sticky, which in medieval terms was basically winning. Next time someone says sugar is poisoned, remember it always has been. It just used to come with a crown and a funeral choir. In the medieval world, spices weren't just condiments, they were currency status symbols and occasionally reasons to stab someone. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg. These weren't just ingredients. They were luxuries hauled across continents by people who risked disease, pirates, and sandstorms, just so Lord Geoffrey could sprinkle a little mace on his eel. A pound of pepper could cost more than a cow. Wars were waged, ships were sunk, and explorers were killed over what now sits forgotten in the back of your kitchen cabinet. Spices came from the Far East, and getting them to Europe required a supply chain that made modern logistics look like kindergarten snack duty. Caravans crossed deserts dodging raiders and dehydration. Merchants sailed through shark-infested storm-punching waters, while praying they wouldn't die of dysentery before reaching a halfway decent port. By the time spices hit European markets, they were marked up by several 100%. And nobles paid gladly because nothing screamed, "I'm better than you," like saffron in your porridge. But not all was as it seemed. Medieval spice merchants were the original scam artists. They sold dyed wood chips as cinnamon, ground rocks as pepper, and God knows what as rare Eastern blends. If you didn't know your cumin from your corpse powder, you could easily end up flavouring your stew with something that belonged in a grave. Quality control didn't exist. Neither did shame. And for those who went after the source, explorers, traders, crusaders, it was often a one-way trip. The journey to India or the Spice Islands was a death gauntlet. Pirates, scurvy, dehydration, mutiny, take your pick. All for the chance to come home and die in a puddle of money and syphilis. Spices were the Bitcoin of the medieval world, volatile, seductive, and riddled with people who claimed to know what they were doing. So yes, your cinnamon latte has a blood-soaked past. That cardamom. Someone probably died for it. The medieval spice trade wasn't just about taste, it was about obsession, greed, and global power. You weren't seasoning your food. You were gambling with history's most expensive flavour dust. And you better believe they made it spicy. Think medieval people didn't have fast food. Oh, they did if by fast you mean suspicious, and by food you mean possible parasite delivery system. Street vendors were the original drive-through experience minus the drive and the hygiene. Picture narrow alleys reeking of boiled meat, open fires, and someone yelling hot pie while rats nonchalantly stroll past. You paid a few coins, got a mystery pie, and hoped it wasn't 90% pigeon and 10% plague. What was on the menu? Meat pies with meat that could be anything from lamb to alley cat. Sausages made from organ scraps, breadcrumbs, and blind faith. Fish occasionally fresh, but more often fried in week-old oil, with the texture of regret. Stews kept simmering all day in the same pot sometimes for days, developing a flavour profile best described as feral. If you've ever eaten at a gas station in the middle of nowhere and questioned your life choices, you get the vibe. Food stalls were rarely regulated unless you count a guy in a robe occasionally poking a pie with a stick. Vendors reused skewers, hands, cloths, and anything else not currently on fire. Cross-contamination wasn't just likely, it was inevitable. You could order a slice of eel pie and get a bonus dose of typhoid with no extra charge. And seating, you stood, you squatted, or you leaned against a wall that probably witnessed 6 different crimes that morning. Still, street food was popular. It was fast, it was hot, and it didn't require a fire at home, which was a huge perk when your home was a wooden box with a thatched roof and an attitude. Workers grabbed breakfast pies on the way to market. Drunks grabbed sausage rolls on the way out of the tavern. Pilgrims bought fried fish while pondering their mortal sins. No one asked what was in anything. That was a rule. Of course, the flip side of this medieval munchie culture was constant gastrointestinal roulette. Diarrhea was less an event and more a lifestyle. Foodborne illness didn't just ruin your day, it could ruin your entire village. But when your other options were mouldy, bread, well water, or chewing a belt, sometimes a questionable meat pie was the most delicious kind of danger. In medieval Europe, cooking wasn't just a culinary act, it was a cosmic negotiation. People didn't just wonder if their stew would give them dysentery, they worried it might also offend a forest spirit. Superstitions filled the kitchen like smoke, thick and unavoidable. Bread baked on Good Friday was believed to never mould. Eggs laid on Maundy Thursday could cure snake bites. And if your butter wouldn't churn, clearly a witch hexed your cow. Classic cow drama. Garlic warded off the plague onions, absorbed evil vapours, and rosemary kept demons out of your soup. Food wasn't just nourishment, it was battlefield armour against unseen forces, real or imagined. Recipes were passed down not just for taste but for spiritual safety. Spilling salt, terrible omen. Stirring with the wrong hand, invitation to Satan's brunch. The line between kitchen and curse book was thin. And let's talk about the cursed recipes. There were foods you simply didn't mess with. Black hens eaten only under full moons. Mushrooms treated like a culinary game of Russian roulette. One bite could feed the family, the next could end the family. Nightshades like tomatoes and eggplants were feared as demonic fruits. Tomatoes especially were thought to cause madness, which is hilarious considering people were already drinking lead-laced wine and calling it medicine. Some cookbooks read more like grimoires. Mix this herb with that wine under the light of a waxing moon, whisper a prayer, then boil until screaming stops, probably from the goat. People believed love potions could be baked into pies. Lust could be summoned with rosemary and bacon. And if your lover didn't return your affections, clearly your bread wasn't properly enchanted. Obviously. These weren't isolated beliefs, they were common knowledge. In a world where science was guesswork and the weather was God's mood swing food, became spiritual insurance. Cooking was survival ritual and low-key sorcery all in one. So next time your toast lands butter side down, just be glad no one's accusing you of consorting with demons. Or worse, forgetting to salt it on a Wednesday. Behind every medieval feast, whether it was rat stew or gilded swan soufflé, was someone elbow-deep in grease smoke and screaming. Enter the medieval cook, a professional hovering somewhere between genius servant and human fire hazard. In noble households, the kitchen was a war zone. Giant fires, no ventilation, endless demands, and an angry noble threatening decapitation if the eel jelly wasn't jiggly enough. Culinary school didn't exist. Your training was don't die, don't burn down the hall, and don't poison the Baron unless it's on purpose. Cooks weren't alone. They had armies of scullions, the lowest of the low, whose job was to scrub pots gutfish and absorb the collective abuse of everyone above them. They were often children, or the desperately poor working in choking heat surrounded by screaming blood and boiling liquids. Getting burned was part of the job description. Getting fired literally or figuratively was always a risk. You didn't just mess up dinner, you endangered your job, your life, and possibly the kingdom's reputation. In peasant homes, the cook was whoever hadn't collapsed from exhaustion. Usually women juggling childbirth, fieldwork, laundry, and the fine art of not letting porridge catch fire. Tools were basic knives, cauldrons, sticks, and sheer willpower. You didn't have time for plating or seasoning. You boiled, stirred, hoped it didn't kill anyone, and served it with a side of apology. Most recipes were oral, passed down like spells. Add 3 pinches unless it's raining, then 4 and pray. Royal kitchens were different, but not better. More staff, more tools, more pressure. The king's cook had to prepare dozens of dishes, all served in elaborate order, often while being watched by nobles ready to snitch. Poisoning paranoia ran high. Royal tasters existed for a reason, and being one was like playing a medieval version of Russian roulette with venison pie. One wrong sauce, and you didn't just ruin dinner, you started a war. And yet despite the burns, the curses, and the daily risk of disembowelment by hungry night, medieval cooks got the job done. Meals were made, feasts were thrown, and somehow people survived long enough to complain. Because in the end, whether it was a palace or a pigsty, someone had to light the fire, stir the pot, and pray the eel didn't explode. Let's face it, if we swapped places with a medieval diner, most of us would be dead by breakfast. You in your climate-controlled apartment, sipping kombucha and Googling low-acid coffee alternatives, would not last 10 minutes in a smoky hut, eating fish pudding that's been aging like a fine biohazard. Forget the food pyramid, this was the food guillotine. Every meal was a calculated risk. Every snack could double as a last rite. We complain today when our avocado isn't perfectly ripe. Meanwhile, medieval folks were chewing on bark, praying their bread wasn't laced with ergot fungus, and washing it down with lightly alcoholic sewer juice. You can barely survive a gluten reaction. They survived plague toast, and when they got lucky they had a roast pig with a side of lead sauce, and a dessert sculpture made of regret and sugar. Modern diets are built around health macros and aesthetics. Medieval diets were built around what was still breathing or recently stopped. They didn't count calories. They counted days since their last hallucination-inducing rye loaf. And through it all they ate. They endured mouldy cheese-cursed vegetables, butchered beavers, fried mystery meat and pies that may or may not have contained a hoof. But somehow this unhinged culinary circus kept civilization moving. Castles were built, kingdoms rose, babies were born all powered by fermented barley water and gruel that could also be used as mortar. The human body, it turns out, is disturbingly adaptable, even when fed on despair and overcooked cabbage. Still, just because they could survive, it doesn't mean you could. And let's be honest, you'd absolutely tap out at your first bite of cold eel jelly. So next time you order sushi and worry it's too raw, remember 1,000 years ago people were eating bread full of rocks, drinking blood-based remedies, and seasoning pork with plague. And they didn't complain. They died, sure, but they didn't complain. You are what you eat. Then thank your overpriced salad. It means you're not made of salted herring and hallucinations.